Alright guys, how's it going? A month ago over at Twitter, I got a humorous tweet from Messer Joe saying that I am the Cassandra of modern tech times, to which I responded, yeah, it can be tough at times. What keeps me going is that one day I know it'll all come true. For those of you lacking verse in Greek mythology, Cassandra was a prophet, or prophetess, who was cursed to speak true prophecies that no one believed. And apparently this was down to Apollo giving her the power of prophecy in an effort to seduce her. But when Cassandra refused him, he spat into her mouth to inflict a curse that nobody would ever believe her prophecies. So a bit of a dick move by Apollo there, and Cassandra went on to become a figure of epic tradition and of tragedy. And basically speaking, in modern usage, her name is employed to indicate someone whose accurate prophecies are not believed by those around them. Which kind of is me. But anyway, the prophecy under scrutiny today is one made 6 months ago during the Ryzen launch. So now I'm going to go over one or two aspects of that back then, just as a reminder of what transpired and what my prophecy was. Now going back to March, and the Ryzen 7 1800X reviews, the CPU was very well received, but also almost unanimously disregarded as a really good gaming CPU. And one of the main reasons for this were games like Rise of the Tomb Raider, where we can quite clearly see here that the 1800X did lag just that little bit behind, too far behind in fact, many of the Intel CPUs. Now of course I did a pretty hefty video on this called Rising of the Tomb Raider, and made the discovery that the issue here wasn't actually Ryzen, but it was the Nvidia drivers. And lo and behold, a month later, Nixies go ahead and patch Rise of the Tomb Raider, showing a 28% boost in performance, and also noting that an optimization was identified in texture management that improved the combination of AMD CPU and Nvidia GPUs. That was just another example of something that came true. But obviously, first impressions do count, and near unanimously it was decided that gaming performance on Ryzen was weak compared to Intel. And here in ugly over at Ars Technica, a higher clocked quad-core chip like the Intel 7700K or 7600K is still the best choice of processor for no compromise gamers. Now this line was repeated over and over throughout the tech press. And in my belated Ryzen 7 review of the R7 1800X and R7 1700, I did note that the 7700K was still a beastly gaming CPU, and really still the gaming CPU of choice. But it was a few weeks later when the R5 1600 and the R5 1600X launched, where I come out all guns blazing against the quad-core i5. Stating that the i5s were basically worthless, and I showed you why I believed that. I showed game benchmarks of the i5 running at 100% CPU load in games like Rise of the Tomb Raider, Ashes of the Singularity, and even stuff like Hitman, Doom, and Fallout 4. And my reasoning was simple: if games today are already showing the i5 nearly tapped out at 100% CPU load, what are games going to be like in a couple of years, assuming that games become even more multi-threaded in future? But the press stuck to their guns, and this time in the Ryzen 5 1600X review over Ars Technica, where the author Mark Walton stated, "Today the performance hit isn't make or break. Yes, the frame rates are lower than Intel's, sometimes significantly as well, but in all cases things are more than playable." Now this is important, so remember that part. But Mark then continued with, 2 years from now though, when 4K gaming may finally be plausible on mainstream graphics cards, the extra headroom on the Intel chips may make them the better long-term investment. And concluding Mark's Ryzen 5 review, he says that the dilemma for gamers is one of longevity. Why does a quad-core Kaby Lake chip keep pace with a 6-core 12-thread Ryzen chip in games, even if its minimum frame times aren't quite as strong? And right at the ugly end once again, Ryzen users may be left wanting as GPUs continue to improve. Now very soon after this, Paul Alcorn over at Tom's Hardware came in for a massive amount of stick in his article The Best CPUs, where he listed 5 CPUs, all of them Intel. Absolutely no Ryzen CPUs whatsoever, and we all know how well that was received. So I did a video on this asking if Tom's Hardware was simply biased towards Intel, and through some close inspection of Paul's article and some of the comments that he had left in the discussion, I basically came to the conclusion that no, Tom's and Paul, they are not biased towards Intel. It was just a couple of things had gone wrong, making the Intel CPUs look better, and I also disagreed with one or two aspects of Paul's analysis, as he believed that games weren't really becoming multi-threaded. It's been talked about for a long time, but it wasn't really happening. But in this video, I actually showed him that using his own numbers, games were becoming more multi-threaded, and the R5-1600X actually did perform better than the i5-7600K in those instances. The only reason the i5 was faster overall was because of big wins in older games, but in almost all the newer games, the R5-1600X performed better. And again in the discussion, Paul had assumed that faster GPUs in future would mean faster performance on the Intel CPU. So pretty much the same as what happened over at Ars Technica, the polar opposite of my own analysis, which said, no, quad cores are going to hit a limit and the performance will simply fall off the edge. I even used further benchmarks of Mass Effect Andromeda and Ghost Recon Wildlands, showing that the i5 was already pretty much tapped out in those games, and that more and more of these were coming. My conclusion in this video was that recommending an i5 today is like recommending a dual core 5 years ago, and that we'd see this within 2 years, a short 6 months later. And it's yet another prophecy which looks like coming true. Over at PCGH, PC Games Hardware, the German website, and we have the new Assassin's Creed game. It's an open world game, and here we can see lots of characters on screen and a very, very punishing benchmark, especially on the CPU. And PCGH do some pretty cool testing. Now this is 1280 by 720 resolution, and they're using a Ryzen 1700 fixed at 3GHz to see what performance difference we get from core scaling. And this is a pretty unusual graph because all the way from the 2-core 4-thread purple line up to the 8-core 16-thread blue line at the top, Assassin's Creed Origins clearly shows some very good core scaling. And again on the same day, over at Computer Base, Assassin's Creed Origins in the benchmark a real thread ripper. Incredible CPU core scaling. Now the game is tested at 1080p with a GTX 1080 Ti Strix, so one of the fastest graphics cards out there. And initially only 5 CPUs were tested. This is because of the DRM and a 5 CPU lock, which apparently resets every day. But the initial 5 CPU test only had the i7-8700K, the Ryzen 7 1800X, the 7700K, the 7600K, and the Pentium G4560. The next day they added the Threadripper 1920X and the rest. As we can see, the 8700K is just that little bit ahead of the Threadripper 1920X. But it's very interesting just to see the 1920X, that little bit ahead of the 1800X. That's a 24-thread CPU up against a 16-thread CPU. So the game must be exhibiting even better than 16-thread scaling. Even with that though, the 1800X is only just tying with the 7700K. But for me, the big story here was the death of the i5-7600K. A massive 48% behind the i7-7700K. That's the same architecture, the i7's extra threads and slightly higher clock speed, contributing a near 50% uplift in performance over the i5. And just as telling, the Ryzen 5 1600X is 30% ahead of the i5. And looking at the 99th percentile frame times, it's even worse. The i5, practically unplayable you would have to say, at 41.4, whereas the 1600X is at 57.5. And right here we have the first indication of basically my prophecy coming true. What you're looking at here is a game that has so much work for the CPU that the 4-core i5 simply does not have enough grunt to do. If you could see the afterburner overlay like what I showed in Rise of the Tomb Raider and all the other games, in those games the loads were hovering around 90 to 100. If you could see the i5 here in Assassin's Creed Origins, all 4 cores would be totally locked at 100%. The CPU is overloaded and it is stalling the graphics card, and that is why the frame rate is so much lower. And the big difference, what really matters here, is that we are talking the difference between playable and unplayable. You remember back at Ars Technica's R5 review, where Mark Walden said, today the performance hit isn't make or break. Yes, the frame rates are lower than Intel's, sometimes significantly, but in all cases, things are more than playable. This was always the difference here. Looking at a game like Hitman 1080p, the i5-7600K averages 97 frames per second. The 1600X averages 88, 97, 88. Yeah, you might be just about able to tell a difference here, but I highly doubt it. The Intel CPUs tend to win at even higher frame rates where it doesn't really matter. Here we're seeing a case where it matters and the i5 simply can't compete. It's the difference between playable and unplayable. Remember what he said about 2 years from now, When 4K gaming may finally be plausible on mainstream graphics cards, the extra headroom on the Intel chips may make them better long-term investment. Looking at Assassin's Creed Origins 4K, the 1080 Ti is a total limiter on it. In this case, the 7600K is on par with the rest. But looking at the 99th percentile again, and we can see that the 7600K is still having some issues that the rest of the CPUs aren't having. Even at 4K with a 1080 Ti, the 7600K is limiting the GPU more than the other CPUs do, even though it's not showing up on the averages. Taking a look at the Pentium, it wasn't that long ago that some were still telling us that this was a great CPU. Okay, it's cheap, but now you can see why it was cheap. In Computer Base's conclusion, Assassin's Creed Origins needs a CPU with 8 threads for full performance. The popular and often bought Core i5 7600K is too slow for full performance at maximum details. Moving over to game GPU, we can test the graphics bottleneck. GeForce GTX 1060, and look, the 2600K is right at the very top. Of course, they're all running at the same 41 frames per second, even the old FX 6300. That's a clear graphics bottleneck. GTX 1070 were pretty much looking at the same thing, even on the GTX 1080. Most of the modern CPUs, even something like the Ryzen 1400, is still running at 69 frames per second. Slightly lower minimums though. You also notice here though that the 7600K is also running a little bit lower minimums than the rest. And when we finally move to the 1080 Ti, we start to see the same story. The Ryzen 5 1600X averaging 89 FPS, with the 7600K down at 79. The minimum's even worse. So that's what happens with faster graphics cards. Remember over at ours, a higher clocked quad-core chip like the Intel i7 7700K or 7600K is still the best choice of processor for no compromise gamers. A mere 6 months later, and it is shown up as a liability that it was always going to be shown up as. Now look, I don't want to give these guys a hard time. That is the last thing I want to do. But on the flip side, I cannot ignore this. Because had I ignored it, then maybe Paul over at Tom's Hardware wouldn't have updated his best CPUs for gaming. We would now see a bunch of Ryzen CPUs in the mix. And I just want to say that he really went the extra mile by adding new charts, gaming price efficiency showing new games only. After I pointed that out in the Tom's Hardware bias video, which Paul clearly watched, he has had a look at the gaming suite and basically agreed that yes, in these newer games we can see that Ryzen was coming to the fore because more cores were being used. And even right now we can see that it really does even the score. And when more games like Assassin's Creed Unity get thrown into the mix, we're going to see the i5 7600K fall away. And now it all looks perfectly reasonable. But I am absolutely certain that many people still chose the 7600K 6 months ago, believing that it would be better going forward. And it was just very frustrating to read review after review, the same thinking simply not taking into consideration that games use more cores as time progresses. And when this happened to the 7600K, it was always going to be the difference between playable and unplayable. And now that is what we are seeing. Soon after the benchmarks went live, there were one or two claims that the reason for the high CPU load was due to DRM, but Ubisoft strongly denied that, saying that the DRM has no perceptible effect on game performance. We may find out if there's truth in that at some point, but some of the claims of DRM having a 40% additional effect, complete and utter nonsense. And DRM just does not work that way. And looking at all this, I decided to take a look back at the older Assassin's Creed games, back to the end of 2012 and Assassin's Creed 3. Even back then it was a very good looking game, and even then we can see a lot of characters on the screen. It's just that type of game obviously. And once again, Computer Base's core scaling benchmarks are very interesting. If you look down here, in 2012, comparing 2 cores at 3.5 GHz to 3 cores at 3.5 GHz, the difference was 39%. So this was a herald of things to come, and there was a massive difference between 4 and 3 as well. 28% difference moving from 3 cores to 4. So the last thing I decided to do was check out Assassin's Creed Unity. You remember that old 720p argument, right? How 720p results might be a good indicator of future performance? Well, this is back at the KB Lake review, so sadly we don't have any Ryzen numbers here. But if you just compare the i7 7700K to the i5 7600K on the same motherboard, there's a difference of 11%. 720p, 11% difference in performance, and that was the previous game sometime early this year, and once again, on the most recent version of the franchise, a massive 48% difference in performance at 1080p. So what did we learn from this? Well, I'm going to let you make up your own minds on that one. This is only one game, and one swallow does not make a summer. And there will be games where the i5 continues to be that little bit better than the R5, no question about that, but it really will be that little bit better, 1-2%. And so the i5 is finally dead. At least the quad-core i5. And this is something that I am celebrating, because as the core counts get held back, gaming just got held back. But what about the new i5s? There is of course a new darling of the press, the Coffee Lake i5. Especially the 8400. I must admit, that is a very, very compelling looking part, or at least it will be on a cheaper motherboard. It is a locked CPU, however, and it is still just an i5. And one of the most telling things about Assassin's Creed Origins, and something I found extremely interesting, was when I found this benchmark over at YouTube of the 8600K, the 8700K, and the 1800X. Now, this is using the in-game benchmark, which looks an awful lot less demanding given the frame rate. But even in this, we can see the 6-core 8600K is constantly running at 90% plus CPU utilization. Already we can see that even 6 cores today in 2017 in a DX11 game, remember, people said it was impossible, but we've now got a DX11 game scaling beyond 16 threads. And yes, it just makes me wonder, are those 6 cores going to be enough? In the interest of fairness, I'm going to point out that the 8600K is ahead of the 1800X, even though the 1800X has 16 threads. But it is certainly something that I would be considering when considering purchasing a CPU like the i5 8400, at least on one of the more expensive motherboards. These are mid-range CPUs, and you clearly do get what you pay for. So be aware of that. The same thing will happen again. These new i5s, I reckon they'll do well for a couple of years, at least the 8400, 2 years. And then I expect to see the same thing happen as what we are seeing today with the quad-core i5s. The great thing about these new Coffee Lake CPUs though, is that once AMD refreshes Ryzen early next year, we can expect to see them go head-to-head with these CPUs with 12 threads, below $200 again, except hopefully with maybe 4.5 GHz and a bit more IPC. So while these 8400s and 8600K maybe look attractive right now, just be wary of that fact, because in February, March of next year, you may just look on jealously at the extra 6 threads of the Ryzen CPUs. I realise a lot of this comes down to money, and not everybody can afford over $400 on an 8700K right now, but the 8700K does look like a beastly CPU, and it is one I expect to remain relevant for maybe 4 years. And if I was buying Intel, that is the one that I would be buying, if you can get a hold of one. Right, so that's pretty much it. There was one more thing I wanted to discuss. It was something that I thought about while reading up on this whole DRM thing. This idea that DRM and encryption was the reason for why the i5 fell away. And it made me realise that there could be a kind of dodgy future here, where a certain CPU manufacturer could have something to gain if such a thing was employed. And doubly so considering Ryzen is very good at encryption. So not only does it have a bunch of spare cores, it's also very good at encryption. So that's just a little thing to think about. We all know that AMD would never stoop so low, right? So, the Cassandra of modern tech times. It is tough, but what keeps me going is that one day I know it'll all come true. But it's not about prophecy, it's about knowing the history. And it's not magic, it's just logic. And I really wish that more in the press would employ it. If you went ahead and bought that quad-core i5 this year after Ryzen released, probably have some regrets. I don't want you to feel bad about that, but it's important to note that I was the one who told you not to do it. While those idiots over at PC Master Race were telling you that i5 is the way to go. So don't shoot the messenger. Right, so I'm done with this one. A little bit different. I know you're all interested in Raja and Intel, but there's nothing to go on there. I can't make a video out of that because there is not enough information. Remember that mini ITX I talked about? That is getting done next week. And I also have a very interesting video coming on the 20th. Plenty to look forward to. In the meantime, check out my Amazon links in the description below, and you'll also see links there to all the articles I've used in this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you later, guys.